Good morning. I am very happy to welcome you all to the Berlin Climate and Security Conference 2020, the second day, and our morning panel today, Dispatches from the Field. My name is Lukas Rüttinger. I am Senior Advisor at Adelphi. If you want to follow the conversation on Twitter or tweet at us, please use the hashtag BCSC2020. And I'm coming to you here from our BCSC studio in the German Foreign Office in Berlin. But I have four distinguished experts from the Climate Security Expert Network with me that join me this morning and that will share their experiences and their insights on climate security risks from around the world and discuss appropriate responses. So the Climate Security Expert Network was founded in 2019, and it's meant to support the group of friends on climate and security in New York and the climate security mechanism of the UN system by providing scientific knowledge and expertise, as well as expert input on how to build resilience against climate security risks. You can find more information on the network at climate-security-expert-network.org, very long URL. And now I will spend a bit of time with each of our discussants, so around 10 minutes, and then open up for questions from the audience. So please, if you have a question, you should see now on the right-hand side of your screen, so right next to the video where you see me, you should see a small window. And there you can enter a question. Please make sure that you also put in your name and affiliation so we know who the question is coming from. And as we move into the discussion, we'll take up these questions. So let's jump right in. Welcome our panelists, and I would like to start with Ottilia Anna Maunganidze, our first panelist. She's head of special projects at the Institute for Security Studies based in South Africa. And Ottilia, welcome. Good morning.
Thank you for having me.
So you have worked particularly on the links between climate change, conflict and migration in Southern Africa and the Horn of Africa. And I'd like to start off with the question of why is climate security an important issue for South Africa and the Horn of Africa?
Right, for Southern Africa as a region, the climate security is of particular importance, not least because this is a region where people are still trying to get sufficient access to water, clean drinking water, but also trying to be able to create safer environments for themselves with a largely agrarian society. The same applies for the Horn of Africa. So for us, with each country, we have different climate stresses, and those mean and those impact the ability of those countries to be able to ensure sufficient stability and peace. So here in South Africa, for example, we have seen the impact that it has when people simply do not have access to water. Parts of our provinces, for example, rely almost exclusively on water from neighboring Lesotho in order to be able to do business. In countries like Zimbabwe and Mozambique, we have seen the devastation of cyclones like Cyclone Idai in last year and the result that has at community level. And in this year in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, we've seen the devastating impact of locusts and particularly also of flooding that has even spread into the Great Lakes region. These are all varying dynamics that affect countries at different levels, but ultimately they impact the ability of these countries to be able to achieve their goals.
Okay, thank you. And then maybe digging a bit deeper and looking specifically on the climate and conflict nexus. What do we need to understand about the climate and conflict nexus in Southern Africa? And also maybe looking a bit into the future, how do you foresee this nexus to develop in the years to come?
For Southern Africa, less so. So what we've seen, for example, are very community level risks that are faced. So not at a national level, where, for example, the limitations where we have had drought or where we have had cyclones, where we've seen at community level more skirmishes and conflicts at that level. That being said, because a lot of this happens in rural or agrarian societies, it does require at least national government as well as provincial government to be able to respond to those stresses, because the result often is that we see people being forcibly displaced out of their communities, moving further inland, whether it is to urban spaces, or moving into places where they simply cannot afford to live. And so it compounds the already existing risks in overcrowded urban spaces that are still developing. These dynamics are perhaps even more stark in the Horn of Africa, where the access or the limited access to resources has really impacted conflict in places like Somalia, Somaliland, and Puntland, but also quite poignantly in countries like Ethiopia, as well as in regions in Kenya.
Thank you. One last question for this first round of questions. I'd like to invite you to maybe share 3 key insights from your research and work on the links between climate change, conflict, and migration.
So, 3 key points to summarize it. The first is to recognize that a climate stress elsewhere will have an impact in other regions. So simply because it's localized doesn't mean that the rest of the country or the rest of the region must ignore it. We have seen how that displacement actually affects those that think they are currently in a comfortable space. The second is that the responses themselves need to be both localized, but also at an elevated national and regional level. Without responses at that level, you simply end up with half-baked responses. The third then is to recognize the multiplicity of these threats, whether it is the cooling down in Southern Africa or the heating up and the excess of rain in regions in East Africa. These are all interconnected and they need to be addressed as such.
Okay, thank you, Ottilia. For now, for these insights, I'd like to move to our next expert, to Chitra Nagarajan. Hi, Chitra, how are you doing?
Fine, thank you, Lucas. Good morning.
Great. Okay, so Chitra, so you've been working in Nigeria since 2013, and you're an independent conflict researcher, journalist, activist, and writer. Your work is really broad, so it focused on climate change, conflict, feminism, foreign policy, migration, Nigeria and the White Lake Chad region, race and sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And you have also been behind much of the work of the Lake Chad report, Shoring Up Stability, and you just finished and published a new risk brief on Mali. And I'd like to concentrate maybe on climate change and security in Mali. Also starting you off with a more general question of why do you think it's important to look at Mali when we discuss climate security risks?
Thank you very much, Lucas. So we know that Mali is experiencing violence in the majority of its regions, whereas the news headlines really concern northern and central Mali. Increasingly, we're seeing worrying tensions escalating into violence in the south as well. At the same time, we see increasing climate variability, particularly when it comes to rainfall, extreme weather events, including floods and droughts. And the impact of both climate change and conflict vary significantly according to age, gender, disability, and other factors. So you have a context where populations are dealing both with significant variability and uncertainty when it comes both to conflict and to climate. People have adapted to some extent, but that adaptation and that resilience is under increasing threat as conflict dynamics worsen and as climate variability increases. And there's a lot going on here. And I think one thing that the briefing that I did showed was actually how much we yet don't know. And perhaps I can talk a little bit about that later on.
Yeah, great. I would actually like to invite you to dig in a bit deeper and maybe tell us a bit more how specifically are climate change and conflict linked in Mali, and also kind of looking ahead with the impacts of climate change exacerbating, how do you foresee these risks and interlinkages to play out?
Thank you. So the risk brief that I did for the Climate Security Expert Network identifies 5 main interactions between climate change and security. And the first really is looking at the nature of governance and the reality that rent-seeking behavior negatively affects both environmental degradation and conflict dynamics. It reduces the ability of both state institutions and institutions of community leadership to manage land-based conflicts. And it's also one of the significant drivers and grievances that lead to people joining armed opposition groups. At the same time, action that does exist on climate and environmental impacts has a significant risk of worsening conflict dynamics. And there were several cases of this, from conflict insensitive land use policies to, for example, the digging of wells to address scarcity of water resources, which then created another resource that people then fought over. At the same time, one of the major adaptations that we're seeing in the face of climate change is migration. And this has been an adaptation in Mali for generations. But the factors that enable this migration are increasingly under threat, and you're seeing increasing tensions between migrants and host communities. So whereas migration is increasing as a result of climate change, broadly speaking, from the north and central regions further south, at the same time, you're seeing increasing hostility towards migrants, and migrants who are never, no matter how long they spend in a particular area, never considered to be from that place, can not own land, and so are vulnerable to appropriation of that land. And at the same time, you have grievances with host communities who see migrants who prosper and think of the unfairness and injustice of that. And already we're seeing in the southern region increasing tensions and conflict over land. And I think looking forward, there is a risk that if action isn't taken now, that those tensions and conflicts can deepen and worsen, and we can see real high levels of violence in the south. And the final 2 conflict risks or climate security risks are really that I think we can say with some level of certainty that conflict over natural resources are likely to increase because the intersection of climate change and conflict decrease the amount of land available that's both safe in terms of the conflict, but also productive when it comes to climate change. And then finally, the interaction of these 2, climate change and conflict, undermine livelihoods and social cohesion. And we see increasing tensions within households, within communities, and between communities as well. And all of what I've mentioned, of course, affects women and men differently. And it's important to state here, I think, as we always do in climate security discussions, that climate change doesn't drive violence in and of itself. And there are lots of kind of factors around governance and corruption and other grievances that really lead to the state of affairs.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think you also answered just the first question that came in from the audience, from Julia Goricho from the WWF, who asked, is climate change by itself creating more violence and armed conflict in this case? And I think you made the point of like that it's an interaction between different factors. And not by itself. So it's a complex interaction. And I think very well also that you underlined the role of governance that it plays in translating kind of climate risks into conflict risks. That seems to be particularly pertinent also in Mali. Maybe one last question also to you, to share maybe 3 key insights from the Mali risk brief.
Okay. Well, I think the number one thing is really the need for more evidence. As I was doing the research to put together the risk brief, it struck me that there's a lot written about Mali and climate change. And there's a lot, Mali and conflict, and there's a lot written about the Sahel and climate change. But we don't actually know much, even when we look at climate change in Mali, how that's affecting the different regions of Mali differently. And Mali is not just Sahelian. You have also the savannas, the delta. There are different climates in Mali, and they're being affected differently by climate change. At the same time, this interaction between climate and conflict, I think there is a lot that's being said and assumed, but not as much empirical evidence as we really need to provide a basis for both policy and programming action. And there's a real need for an integrated assessment that looks at climate dynamics, conflict dynamics, gender, social inclusion dynamics, to really build our understanding of what's going on and provide an evidence base for policy and programming. So that's the first one. The second one is really the ways that climate action can exacerbate conflict dynamics if not done in a conflict-sensitive way. And Mali threw up lots of different examples here, as I've alluded to earlier, one of which is the Forest Service. And this was a service that was established in order to combat desertification. But because of the actions of Forest Service agents, in terms of extortion and other kinds of oppression against people who depend on the forest for their livelihoods, this has really exacerbated grievances and is being used by armed opposition groups to drive recruitment. And then the third key insight is really that we need to maximize and seize on opportunities to do prevention work when it comes to climate security. And I think one example of how we could do this in Mali is really acting to prevent the escalation of the land-based conflict that we're already seeing manifesting in the south. And of course, there are security concerns as to why, this is also a practical point, there are security concerns as to why programming work in the north and even parts of the center of Mali are difficult. But in the south, we see a place where levels of security means that you can do programming, whereas at the same time, there's a real need for proper and inclusive natural resource management mechanisms, early warning mechanisms, to really identify where potential hotspots could be and act to mitigate or prevent conflict dynamics worsening and leading into violence in the future.
Great. Thank you, Chitra. Also, thank you for kind of wrapping it up in these 3 points on the need for more integrated assessments, need to look at our reactions as well of kind of like how in our adaptation work do we avoid creating new conflicts or exacerbating existing conflict dynamics, and then the need for prevention, especially around land conflicts, which is not only for Mali, but like especially for southern Mali, a great peacebuilding and climate security need. So thank you, Chitra, for now. I would now change continents and let me turn to Adriana Abdenur. Hello, Adriana. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. I know that it's very early for you, so thank you for joining us. You're a policy expert and coordinator of the International Peace and Security Division at the Igarapé Institute in Brazil. So you supervise projects on climate security, migration and refugees, conflict mediation and prevention, and peace operations. And you also have just published a risk brief on Latin America and the Caribbean. And my first question for you is, why is it important to also focus on Latin America if you think about climate security risks?
Thank you very much, Lucas, and good morning from Rio de Janeiro. So when we think about Latin America and the Caribbean, the work that has issued forth from the IPCC reports shows that the region is very vulnerable to climate change in very diverse ways. We have intensifying extreme weather events in the Caribbean. We have patterns of soil erosion in Central America, which are, of course, intensifying migratory flows. We also have increasingly unpredictable flood and drought periods, not just in the Amazon, but also in the Cerrado. This is the large savanna region where I'm from. We have fast melting glaciers in the Andes that are threatening food and water security. And at the same time, of course, there's wide variation in climate strategies, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. I think the second reason why we need to pay more attention to Latin America and the Caribbean is that we have the presence of very important biodiversity hotspots and biomes that have not just regional, but even global importance. And as most of you know, there is a whole discussion around whether the Amazon has reached or is reaching a tipping point. But again, there are biomes that are not receiving as much attention, including the Cerrado, the savanna region, whose deforestation is almost as big as that of the Amazon, but it's not being spoken about quite as much, especially in the international community. And what we find in the research is that there's a strong correlation in areas where you have a lot of deforestation and surges in violence and crime. So this is particularly tricky right now because the discourse of national sovereignty in our region has sharpened, which makes international cooperation a little bit trickier, as you know. And then finally, I think that the urgency of the issue is also due to recent political and even geopolitical events here in the region. We have, in many countries in Latin America, including my own, Brazil, as you know, has, for all intents and purposes, practically abandoned the Paris Agreement. And there are rollbacks in not just willingness to address climate change and maintain climate commitments, but indeed serious rollbacks in state capacity and even state willingness. So that brings up the interesting issue of strategic entry points in terms of policy for climate security.
Okay, thank you, Adriana. Also, I would encourage you to dig a bit deeper. You were already talking about the Amazon and the kind of dynamics there, but also how do you see the climate conflict nexus playing out in Latin America in particular? And again, how do you foresee that developing going into the future?
Okay, those are great questions. First, I should say that for the most part, when we talk about this issue here in Latin America, in the region, we're not in general referring so much to open conflict in the way that term is used, for instance, within the United Nations or at the European Union. We do have some exceptions. In Colombia, there is a recognized armed conflict now, of course, in the post-conflict stage, except with a couple of guerrilla groups. But in general, I think the biggest issues in Latin America, they pertain either to patterns of violence and crime, including organized crime, but also patterns of homicides and other violent crime like feminicides, and then patterns of human and food security. So it's quite a different lens that is adopted, for instance, as Chitra was mentioning, with respect to certain regions of Africa where the focus has been on open conflict in the sense of the Security Council uses. I think another really important point that came out of our work is the role of migration as an intermediate variable. It's a huge but very much unacknowledged issue. And here I'm not just talking about trans-border migration, I'm primarily talking about internally displaced people, which is a category that most Latin American countries don't recognize, let alone climate migration. And it's important to note here that we don't consider migration itself to be a security issue, but when you have sudden incoming inflows of people, that can exacerbate tensions. It can lead to xenophobic attacks when they're not adequately integrated into host communities. And we see this right now, not only in Central America, but also here in South America, especially due to the spiraling crisis in Venezuela. We work a lot in Roraima, which is on the Brazilian border with Venezuela, and there's increasing tension and xenophobia, including some violent attacks in that region. And then finally, I think it's very important to note that when we study climate and security in Latin America, we look at the two sides of this cycle, right? And here I'm simplifying, of course, the cycle is very complex. In most regions of the world, I think people are looking at how climate magnifies insecurity. But in Latin America, it's very important to also understand how insecurity contributes towards climate change. And here I'm talking, for instance, about how patterns of environmental crime in the Amazon or in the Cerrado, the savanna region, are the primary causes of deforestation and forest fires, and therefore they're primary causes of green gas house emissions in these regions. So you have a very complex, but a full cycle, a vicious cycle. Now, in terms of opportunities, I think not to be so depressing, we do have relatively robust institutions in the region, and there's tremendous potential there to tap into local solutions and to scale up responses into frameworks and more kind of systematic approaches at subnational, national, and even regional levels.
Thank you, Adriana. Also very important and interesting point that you made there on the complex interactions, that it goes both ways, that we also have insecurity kind of leading to more deforestation, exacerbating climate change and then feeding it again back. Maybe also one last question for you to share 3 key insights from your risk brief.
Okay, so 3 insights. The first I would say is the importance of considering and addressing inequality. Our region, of course, is characterized by deep socioeconomic inequalities along race, ethnicity, gender, class, geographic, rural versus urban lines. And it's really a cross-cutting issue. In all of the studies that we put together, so we have the climate security risk. We also have this publication, by the way, which is available online. It's an edited volume that we launched at COP last year in Madrid. All of the studies noted how inequality shapes the impact that climate has on security and vice versa. And so I think we need to think also about the disproportionate impact that this issue has on indigenous, on Quilombola, which are the Afro-descending communities, but also in low-income urban areas. Here I live in Rio de Janeiro, and the residents of the favelas and the peripheries are much more vulnerable. And again, the correlation between, for instance, extreme weather events here in Rio de Janeiro and violence are also mediated by this geography of inequality. The second important point that came out of our brief, Lukas, is the importance of not throwing out human rights and development. Again, the cycle, this vicious cycle, is extremely complex. And if we think very straight about climate security nexus, I think that cognitively it leads us to maybe overlook those other dimensions, which leads me to my third point. And this is a point that I have thought about a lot since we put out the risk brief and in our discussions over the last few weeks. How do you frame the issue? Because here in Latin America, a lot of countries have political sensitivities around using this term, climate and security, especially at the UN, because they consider that it can lead to excessive securitization. For instance, at the Security Council could be used as justification for military intervention. So I think that this discourse that's not new, but it's now being strengthened, of environmental peace building, is particularly adequate here for Latin America and the Caribbean, because it's, let's say, it's a politically more palatable way of talking about this, but it's also more accurate. It, as I said, it captures the human rights and the development dimensions.
Thank you, Adriana. Yeah, very important point I think you made on inequality and how that is another intermediate factor that kind of translates or is one of those factors that helps sometimes translate climate risks into security risks, and then also very well taking the point on the need for broadening the discourse and being very cautious of how it's perceived in different regions around the world, and keeping it broad to include human rights and development, and making sure that it's not becomes a hard security but more a human security discourse, of course. So thank you, Adriana. Lastly, I would like to turn to Olli Brown. Hello, Olli. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Hi.
Welcome. So you're an associate fellow at Chatham House and the Geneva Center for Security Policy, as well as a senior advisor at TrustWorks Global. Before that, you were based for 4 years in Nairobi, and before that, 2 years in Sierra Leone, where you worked on the links between climate change, environment, and conflict for UN Environment. And you also just finished a paper on the EU's response to climate security risks, but you also have been working very close to the international and regional policy processes to address climate security risks. And against that background and kind of what we just heard in terms of differences between regions, but maybe also similarities, what kind of international and regional responses do we need against that background?
I mean, that's the big question, isn't it, Lukas? Thank you. I mean, I think there's four things. It's firstly, we need to avoid dangerous climate change. Secondly, we need to understand what's happening to climate change. Thirdly, we need to respond appropriately. And fourthly, we need to work together. So they're easy to say, they're somewhat more difficult to do. Let me just, if I can, just take those one by one and unpack them a little bit, because they're really important. I mean, I think what comes out of all of the things that have come before, what Adriana and Ottilia and Chitra were saying, is just how serious potentially climate change is. And I should just remind us that we're talking about linear climate change at the moment, climate change on current trajectories between now and 2050 as the current trends are developing. But actually, if we start thinking about, hitting tipping points for climate change, where we start seeing things like the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet, or the slowdown of the Gulf Stream, or mass dieback of the Amazon, melting of the Arctic permafrost, then we start having runaway impacts on climate change that start getting extremely serious, where, I mean, frankly, our imaginations aren't quite vivid enough to sort of think what could happen. So, I mean, the first thing, obviously, is we have to avoid climate change that is taking us above 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees above pre-industrial averages, remembering that even that means that in most places, the climate's going to be warming more than that, because land areas tend to warm faster than the global averages. So critically, we have to implement the Paris Agreement. We have to fight back against some of these things that Adriana was just saying, with the international community stepping back from the commitments they made in Paris. Already, we have the next generation often of political leaders who weren't there in Paris, didn't sign the declaration, don't necessarily feel the same amount of personal commitment to the Paris Declaration. And so we need to just make sure that whole momentum is kept, and that we don't take our eye off the ball on avoiding just the worst impacts of climate change, where it moves from being a kind of linear thing to being something that's exponential. But even if we do that, we have a whole lot of climate change that is already baked into the climate system, because the climate system is dealing with the last 150 years of emissions, and even if we stopped emissions tomorrow, the climate is going to carry on changing. Which leads me to my second point. We need to understand what's happening, and as each of these risk briefs shows, it's happening in very different ways in different places. So we have to be led by the data. We can't be led by sort of advocacy or a misunderstanding of the science. We have to just be rigorous and come back to these inconvenient truths about what is happening. Understand how impacts, as Chitra was saying, in one place have consequences in another. And put those into things like early warning systems to understand how these issues are developing, warn people when disasters are about to strike, and just have policy that is led by science. Which leads me to my third point, which is that policy, that science, has to drive appropriate policy. Now, climate change is the ultimate problem at scale. It's happening everywhere across the entire world. So we need to be a lot better at managing all of our resources. We need to be better at managing the finite amounts of fertile land we have, the finite amounts of fresh water we have. We need to find new clean energy sources. There are endless things we can do to improve the way that we live on this planet, to deal with climate change, to adapt to its impacts. And the good news is that many of these things we should be doing anyway. They're no regrets scenarios. If we can use our land more efficiently, then that's great. That's great in the context of climate change that might be increasing land degradation, but it's also great in the context of biodiversity, nature, our ability to get out into nature, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole range of things we need to do. We need to understand for each thing that we do what the return is on that investment. Some of these things are good to do anyway, and some of these things, as I think Chitra was saying, there are some interventions that might have negative impacts that we need to be aware of. But I think ultimately we have to have an approach that is based around risk management, understanding what the risks are, investing at scale in interventions that can really address those risks, And to do that comes to my fourth point. We need to work together. And as Adriana was saying, the context in which we're operating now has got more difficult. We are facing headwinds as an international community that we didn't face 5 years ago, frankly, in terms of individual countries wanting to go out by themselves, a loss of faith in the international processes in multilateral cooperation. So we need to really just re-emphasize the fact that climate change is one of those issues. It's a cliche, but it doesn't recognize borders. And it's only going to be dealt with if we work together. And that's not a bad thing. And we need to be consistently saying and proving that it's possible to address these issues together.
Great. Thank you, Olli, for these 5 points. Maybe one thing I would like you to dig a bit deeper into, and it's a very specific challenge, and I think it's also a general challenge, not only for this policy area, but for many others. But I'd like you to reflect a bit on how can we make sure that we really integrate local circumstances, local differences, the differences in discourse, for example, that Adriana was talking about, into international processes. How can we make that link better?
Well, I mean, look, I think as the risk briefs were showing, context is key. There's a whole series of these megatrends that are reshaping our planet, of which climate change is one, but also population growth, rural to urban migration, the growth in technology, the growth in artificial intelligence, connectivity, travel, all of these things are reshaping our planet, but they're affecting everywhere in different ways. And so what we need to do, I think, is to think about how those trends, those factors are affecting different places, and frankly, to involve people in those decisions. I mean, it shouldn't be the likes of you or me coming in and telling people in Mali, this is how you should be living your lives, this is what we think you should be doing. The single biggest way to involve people in decisions is to give them control over those decisions. And the way to do that, coming back to, I guess, my points from before, is to give them the information so that they can develop approaches that are relevant and appropriate for their own context. And to do that, you need the information to make those decisions.
Great, yeah, great point on that the affected population groups need to be part of these kind of decision-making processes. Also maybe linking it back to the importance of inclusive governance in general in addressing climate-fragile issues. Thank you, Olli. I would like now to turn to our whole panel. And I have one round of questions that I've prepared, and then after that we'll open the discussion for more questions from the audience. So if you have more questions, please keep bringing them in, and I will have them here on my screen and can pick them up. But I'll start with Ottilia. And also I want to move also more into the response side of things. And Ottilia, with you, kind of with your regional experience and perspective, where do you really see the specific role of regional cooperation structures, and maybe where do you see them standing at the moment in your region? Oh, I think you need to unmute yourself.
I think it goes without saying, and Olli stressed this point quite well, which is that we simply have to work together. And I'll focus a bit more here on Southern Africa in responding, One of the things that we've seen is where, particularly a climate event, so let it be a cyclone, for example, as what happened with Cyclone Idai in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, where it touches on two countries, it's almost immediate from the regional bodies, in this case, the Southern African Development Community, to need and to work towards a regional response. The challenge comes in where it does not affect more than one country. And this idea, and I think Adriana touched on this, which is the issue of sovereignty, almost blocks the ability of regional communities to really engage in a more constructive way, because it becomes a national problem. But what we've heard already, and I think this bears repeating, because it's happening in one part of the country, or just because it's one country, doesn't mean that it does not affect the other countries or the rest of the region. And this is something that needs to be then addressed. So in this regard, in Southern Africa, we're looking at the particular role that the Southern African development community can play across the different sectors. But we're also looking at the role that the African Union as the continental body can play in advising different regional economic communities, because there are lessons that can be learned from Nigeria, South Africa, or neighboring countries in the region simply not tapping into. And there needs to be that exchange of information and learning, as well then as the responses that need to take place.
Thank you. Chitra, I also have another question for you. Can you tell us a bit more about the role of gender dynamics, the kind of role that they play in shaping climate security risks, but then also what that really means in terms of responses?
Thank you, Lucas. This is a very important question, and one, quite frankly, that I feel we don't spend enough time examining in climate security discussions. So when I look at Mali, it's important to start by saying that gender norms vary significantly between different communities and regions. And as a result, we need to really take intersectional approaches when it comes to gender, looking specifically at what the gendered risk of climate security are when it comes to different communities, but also different groups. For example, women with disabilities have very different experiences of climate security compared to non-disabled counterparts. But broadly speaking, I think we can say that those with resources and power can better respond to, adapt to, and prepare for climate events and variability. And because of gender inequality, resources are unevenly distributed within households. For example, in Mali, although women make up 75% of the agricultural workforce, they rarely own the land on which they work. They don't have equitable participation to markets, financing, social networks. They're also hindered from migration, which is a key form of adaptation in the face of both climate change and conflict risks that we see in Mali, but also in the Lake Chad work that we did. And as a result, gender inequalities really block the resilience of women and girls. They also affect the ways that people experience both climate change and conflict. So in many of the countries in which I've worked with, men and adolescent boys are more viewed with suspicion by conflict parties. They're more likely to be subject to arbitrary detention, extrajudicial killings, and other risks, whereas women and girls make up the majority of those displaced and really struggling to keep their families and their communities going in the face of violence. However, despite kind of these very different experiences of climate change, security, and the interaction of the two, in most places in the world, patriarchal norms hinder women's participation when it comes to conflict management and peace building, despite the fact that many women that I've spoken to actually really express a real desire to be involved in this decision making, despite the obstacles and resistance, and find other ways to mobilize. I think it's also important when we talk about gender to think about to driving conflict and violence. And I spoke about natural resource conflicts before. And here I think we really need to see the ways that men are socialized to think of themselves as protectors of the family, protectors of the community, including of women and girls who are subjected to violence due to conflict. And there's a real pressure on young men in particular to join community militias, armed opposition groups, to protect communities from harm. And also because this garners them status and power that they're often denied by mainstream society, where you have very real hierarchies according to age. And so their involvement in fighting to defend their communities gains them community respect. It can give them better access to women and also better marital prospects than their peers. So this is all to say, it's really crucial to integrate gender into climate security discussions, not only because it's important in and of itself, but also without proper gender analysis, you don't understand the situation. So I think when it comes to response, that's number one. Like really make sure that we integrate gender into discussion, gender into the integrated assessments that we do. Number two is find ways to increase women's participation in climate security discussions, in decision making, in natural resource management, and at the same time, really integrate the gender perspectives into these decision making as well. So first of all, kind of find out what's going on and then integrate that into the response that takes place. And the third thing that I would strongly recommend is the need to see the risk of violence against women and girls and how that changes when it comes to changing climate, when it comes to insecurity, and really see gender-based violence risks as integral to our climate security analysis.
Thank you, Chitra, and thank you also for like the really concrete examples. I think that is really important to kind of make the point, as you said, that gender is not really just an afterthought, but is kind of integrated from the beginning, and that it really is part of the risk landscape, but then also really important as part of the solutions. Adriana, I think I'll move a bit to questions from the audience with you, and there was one question on the links between, if you could go a bit deeper into the links between climate change and violent crime, which I also find very interesting, some of your research that comes out. So maybe if you can dig a bit deeper into the links between climate change and violent crime, including femicide, and then tell us what that means in terms of responses, maybe elaborating a bit on your work on environmental peace building.
Thank you. So yes, this is I think a very exciting, a very concerning area of research. And what we know so far is that it's hard to predict when you have extreme weather events what the impact will be in patterns of violent crime. We've had a couple of studies, especially of urban regions in the city of Manaus in the Amazon, and there is an effect over time where you have, for instance, an extreme rain. For the first few days, you have a decrease in violent crime, but depending on the impact of that event on infrastructure, that can actually lead to increases after that initial period. We're also doing studies here in Rio de Janeiro, where we also have very heavy rains that typically kill quite a few people every time. And what we see too is that when infrastructure, whether hard or social infrastructure, is heavily affected, that can open up more space for organized crime to operate, especially within the present context where you have a severe rollback in the role of the state. And I'm referring to even pre-COVID context. In rural scenarios, it's also, we're starting to perceive some patterns. As I mentioned before, there's a very strong correlation visually. So we are using layers of georeference data, combining information on deforestation and on violent crime patterns. And you can see that the same hotspots of violent crime and violence in general coincide. That's not the best word. They're associated with deforestation. And if you think about it, deforestation literally opens up space physically, but also socially, for all kinds of criminal activities to come in, again, feeding into this violent cycle. Now, the good news, at least on the rural end of this story, we know what works. 2009, we had a reduction in deforestation of 43% relative to the previous year. So the spike in forest fires and deforestation that we see right now, they're even more stunning because we had a period at that time when Brazil was the poster child of how to build effective policies. And it's a combination of state policies through improved monitoring. It's commitments by the private sector. We had a moratorium, for instance, on soy agriculture in the Amazon, and enhanced monitoring through participation of civil society. So we know what works. it's a political issue of getting back to that stage and enhancing that solution through other initiatives. And Ottilia mentioned the challenge of regional cooperation when you have this discourse of national sovereignty. But if we can get that right through new modalities of international cooperation, for instance, greater cooperation with subnational actors. The governors of the Amazon right now are very much willing and interested, but we don't have the legal frameworks in place. So I think that if we take that old model, but we enhance it in light of this climate and security or environmental peace building debate, we can help to address the violence and the organized crime, including environmental crime aspects of this problem, not just here in Brazil, but across the region.
Thank you, Adriana. And also thank you to Liam Robson from the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs for that excellent question. Another question that I would like to pose to Olli, also from the audience on concrete interventions, and specifically if you have any examples of concrete interventions that effectively address these kind of compound risks that work across sectors.
Great question. I mean, there's loads, I guess. The first one is to have mechanisms to understand these issues together, and then to build it up as one overall kind of risk understanding of the challenges that are facing a particular country. But then have, for example, adaptation programs that also include peace building. So there's examples of this from around the world, but every country is facing its own particular set of challenges related to climate change. And it's finding its resource base, its population affected in different ways by how climate change is impacting that country. Adaptation programs are addressing those issues. A lot of these things are no regrets strategies anyway, as I was saying before. They're ways to encourage better use of land, better use of water, cleaner use of energy, and so on. But you can do that in a way that brings different groups of people together. Adaptation programs themselves can be an impetus to get different communities to sit around a table and say, what do we have? What are our challenges? Where is our world taking us? And what do we want to do as groups of people who are affected, who live in this country together, to address those issues? So I think adaptation programs, which is, I guess, one of the major mechanisms where millions of dollars of development funding is flowing, can be used to drive peace building by thinking about some of these climate security impacts, by bringing in some of these issues of human rights, of gender, as Chitra was saying, and encouraging people with a sort of, there's an incentive to come together and use that as a way of getting people to have a common discussion around what they need to do, and frankly have the resources to be able to put that into place. So let me just give you one example from my previous life with the UN Environment Programme. In Darfur, there was a program that UNEP was doing in this big, dry, sort of seasonal riverbed, Wadi El Ku. And that was a program to bring people up and down this river catchment area, basically, together to discuss and agree how they use water, and to put in place mechanisms to capture that water and use it better, so it doesn't just flood in a torrential rain downpour and go away. And over time, that built up to a project that was involving something like 80,000 people, I think, setting up community groups to manage the water, to discuss it, and to deal with these inherent power dynamics that you have some communities upstream and some communities downstream. And the risk is that there's tensions over those communities that are downstream that feel that they're not getting enough water. And we see this at a local level in small river catchments like Wadi El Ku, at an international, regional level like the Nile Basin, for example. And you can have an intervention that is about adaptation, is about water management, is about peace building, and is about community kind of capacity building and strengthening and giving people a voice, that all comes together in one way, if you understand some of these interactions and how they play out.
Thank you, Olli. We have a lot of questions, really interesting questions coming in. Another one, kind of a topic that we've touched upon before within our discussion and also the presentation, kind of migration as an opportunity and challenge. Ottilia, we have a question from Mr. Cicinho Eyebe Mbana Makina from the Embassy of Equatorial Guinea here in Berlin. And his specific question is, how can low and middle income countries of origin and destination better work together to address the challenges around migration, but also use the opportunities that are within migration as well, especially in terms of kind of development in both the origin and in the receiving countries?
That's a really great question. And I think, touching on not just the low and the middle income, but also where they are the upper middle income countries. So I'll use here, the current example of South Africa, which is primarily a destination country, but also a country that has significantly benefited from migration, whether it's people that have been forcibly displaced or those that have voluntarily come to the country. However, at the same time, it's been imposing increasingly stringent measures when it comes to entry into South Africa. And over time, I think there's been great reflection on how this actually impacts the ability of not just the country, but the region to be able to develop the way that it needs to and the way that it wants to. And so here, and what the African continent has been pushing towards now is a greater African continental free movement zone, essentially, that allows for greater flows, not just of people for visiting purposes, but also as it relates to labor migration and the exchange of ideas and tech. Because it is there that we'll be able to actually develop the sub-regions and then hopefully be able to develop the continent as a whole. So those that are already middle income have a lot to share with countries that are trying to get to middle income level. Likewise, the low income countries can be able to provide critical exchange of expertise as well as resources. And so it really is about, where possible, leveraging as much as possible the benefits of migration while limiting and reducing the risks or mitigating the risks, as it were.
Great, thank you, Ottilia. And I'll be jumping a bit between different topics to just kind of reflect the breadth of questions we're getting in, but also kind of the breadth of knowledge that I have in front of me. Next question I'd like to pose towards Chitra, and it's from Dr. Gerrit Kurz. He's a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, and he asked the question, how can UN peace operations work on climate-related security risks, in particular in Africa? And I think you touched upon that in your Mali risk brief regarding MINUSMA, so maybe you can tell us a bit more about how peace operations can take that into account.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I think let me start by acknowledging that we have seen significant progress when it comes to peacekeeping operations, in that we're starting to recognize that climate impacts and environmental impacts are an area that peacekeeping operations should be looking at, which is positive. However, there's a lot more need for conflict analysis that really looks at climate security risks. And I think there's a lot more that can be done in this field, not just doing the analysis, but also looking at some of the implications. And I can give example here from MINUSMA. MINUSMA does quick impact projects. And one of the things that the quick impact projects look at are climate risks. And so, for example, looking at need for water, for example, in communities, and trying to meet that need for water through digging of wells, etc. However, at the same time, as I mentioned before, by doing that, you're creating a resource, and you can't assume that that's going to be entirely conflict neutral or conflict positive, and that there have been cases, not around the wells dug by MINUSMA, as far as I'm aware, but other wells in Mali that have been dug by people who've been trying to provide water resources for communities that are in need of them, But what happens then is that this attracts other people. And so, for example, you've had one particular area of Mali where wells were dug for pastoralists in a particular pastoral reserve, which then led to farmers coming and settling there, and over time asserting rights over the land surrounding these wells, and thereby increasing tensions, and then that led to worsening farmer-pastoralist relations. So you can't assume that the projects that you undertake to address climate risks will automatically be wholly positive. You need to, and this goes back to the point earlier, really make sure that you're being conflict sensitive, and as part of that, really invest time and energy and resources in conflict analysis that integrates climate security risks.
Thank you, Chitra, again, and yeah, underlining the need here for kind of the importance of proper analysis in the beginning to then integrate it more thoroughly later. Adriana, I have a question for you from Sylvia Danielak. She's a researcher at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the question is, climate change and conflict have differentiated impacts on rural and urban environments. And that's something that we've heard before as well, also in your presentation. How can policies take into account dynamics of urbanization as well as specific urban disaster and conflict risks? And what would urban peace building in the context of climate risks look like?
Thank you. Those are really interesting questions. What we observe here in the region in Latin America and Caribbean is that in general, there's been little investment in climate adaptation in the urban settings. And again, within the context of high inequality that we have here in the cities across all of those social cleavages, this leaves a low-income population, but also special categories such as indigenous and Afro-descending particularly vulnerable. And this is reflected in the patterns that we see whenever there is, for instance, an extreme weather event. I think in terms of the rural areas, as I've mentioned, the disputes over natural resources, in our region, especially over land, because there's such an unequal distribution of land. And this has been exacerbated by state policies. I mean, the state has been, if you like, a criminogenic factor in that it has, not just recently, although it's particularly strong here now in Brazil, but historically, the states, for instance, in the Amazon region, they have promoted invasion, even illegal invasion of land with the explicit or implicit promise that eventually there'll be an amnesty. And so that's, you have the story of impunity that feeds into this cycle. So when we talk about peace building, and I love your question, urban peace building, I think, requires investments in a positive presence by the state, right? We have areas here in Rio de Janeiro, as you probably know, where there is no state presence except for forceful police or military incursions. So you don't have health clinics, you don't have an adequate public education system, you don't have investments in drainage systems. This is a massive problem right now in Brazilian cities. And this, again, it reinforces the inequalities that are pre-existing. I've spoken already a little bit about rural peace building, but I think it's very important to underscore this, that we've actually had a lot of success in the past, right, which entails a multi-stakeholder model. It's not just the state that can resolve this, although we need the state to help lead by setting a discourse and an action plan that is geared at environmental peace building rather than destruction of natural resources. And then one final point, for both rural and urban peace building, I think we need to look at this idea of post-COVID recovery as a chance to rethink the links between urban and rural, right? Here in Rio de Janeiro, like in many cities, we're now purchasing directly from producers in the interior of the state. This is not the result of policies. This is the result of kind of an automatic demand that arose as supply chains were affected. So we need to rethink the urban and rural, but I also think that this discussion of recovery, and I don't like to call it economic recovery, I like to call it socio-environmental recovery, because that ultimately is what we're talking about. I know it's more advanced in Germany. I've been following some of the debates. Here in Latin America, we need to have a very serious discussion about how to correct some of the mistakes that we have made so far, and also look to the future in terms of green transition. I mean, ultimately, I really believe that green transition and thinking about these solutions is peace building. Peace building requires much more than investments in security, investments in development and the protection of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting, interesting question, and even more interesting answer. Let me move over to Olli. We have a question from Jana Greve, a senior project manager at the Crisis Management Initiative in Brussels, on how can regional organizations and mechanisms be better supported by the EU and the EU member states to enhance collaboration regarding climate security and ensure ownership of these initiatives?
Thanks. That's such a great question. Look, I mean, I think that the main thing, if I was going to say one thing, is leadership. I mean, that's what the EU can do. And these are issues that are hugely political. I mean, the EU is often seen as an ATM providing funding for these things, but I don't think it should be about just funding. It's really around showing what is possible to work together, to harness all of these different levers to address different security issues. I mean, you know, the EU is a living, breathing experiment in cooperation over natural resources. It had its birth in the Coal and Steel Agreement in 1951 as a way of stopping conflict, and that is a tremendously powerful example for other places around the world. And I think the way that the EU can bring in its different diplomatic levers, its development levers, its political levers, its economic levers, is really important to show what is possible. And what we're seeing is that lots of other regional organizations are working on this area already. I mean, as Adriana was saying and Ottilia was saying, IGAD is working on these areas, NATO is working on these areas, the OSCE is working on these areas, the African Union is working on these areas. What I think the EU can do is to show leadership, develop sort of innovative ways of bringing these issues together, to influence that discussion, to keep it on the agenda, to work with those regional organizations, recognizing that, frankly, we're all connected and that a security issue in one part of the world is going to affect people in other parts of the world. And so we need to be working together. And I think the EU can play a tremendously important political role in leading by example, but then also, encouraging other regional organizations to step up to the plate on this. Back to you, Lukas.
Thank you. Thank you, Olli. More questions coming in, very interesting ones. Here's a particularly interesting one I find from Stephanie Wesch from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Impacts. So she underlines that it seems that policymakers are more concerned with violence between organized armed groups and less with lower level intercommunal violence, like violence between pastoralists and sedentary farmers in the Sahel, or homicide rates in Latin America. The question here is, what's the connection between those two? So is there a connection between organized armed groups and these lower levels of violence? And maybe I can get different flashpoints from around the table. Maybe Chitra, I'll start with you, and then I'll hand over to Adriana so she can reflect a bit on the Latin American context.
Yes, thank you, Lukas. And I really want to thank our colleague from the Potsdam Institute for this question. I think she touches on something that has been of great concern. So in the context of Nigeria, where I've spent many years of my life living and working, we see a real focus on conflict in northeast Nigeria between armed opposition groups and the Nigerian state, less of an emphasis on farmer pastoralist violence in kind of the north central, middle belt, northwest regions. And this is not necessarily due to the scale of violence. In fact, especially in recent years, there's an argument to be made that more people have been killed and displaced due to farmer pastoralist violence, or violence that's framed as farmer pastoralist violence. The reality is a lot more complex. than actually people in the Northeast. And yet all the conversations, the funding, the interventions continue going to the Northeast. And I think this is really a factor of kind of the whole international narrative around the war on terror. And it's really important to look at different forms of violence and how they manifest. And in terms of the links between the two, it's difficult to say, and I don't want to. There are assumptions being made in Nigeria, for example, around Islamic State West Africa coming from the northeast and coming from across the border with Niger. So both Islamic State West Africa and also Islamic State in the Sahel, and influencing dynamics in northwest Nigeria around farmer pastoralist conflict. And I feel that these links are being made, which are not necessarily undergirded by empirical evidence that shows that these groups are coming in and having an impact. However, notwithstanding that, I think it's possible to say that intercommunal violence creates an opportunity that armed opposition groups can take advantage of. And I think Mali is a very good example of this, where you see existing tensions around access to natural resources in the center of Mali, and jihadi groups really taking advantage of this, and taking advantage of this by playing on people's grievances around denial of access to land, around being charged exorbitantly to access land, in order to use that in their recruitment dynamic. So I think I both want to sound a note of caution around assuming a link or stressing a link without the evidence to back that up, but also recognizing that there can be links in some circumstances. And this is one of many reasons why we should really make sure that our interventions look at all forms of violence rather than being guided by the spectacular forms of violence that are seen as being terrorist in nature.
Thank you. Adriana, same question over to you. Kind of where do you see the links between organized armed groups and intercommunal violence or different kinds of violence like urban violence in Latin America?
Thank you for the question, Stephanie. First, I think we can't refer to these patterns as lower levels of violence. We have to remember, for instance, that Latin America and the Caribbean is the most violent region in the world, even compared to areas that are more conflict affected in the sense of open conflict. So the levels of homicide here are indescribable. And what are the root causes of this? Then I think you have to look at different types of actors that include illegal armed groups, but also state actors. We have, for instance, criminal networks, and much of the attention has been paid to illegal drug trade factions, and they kind of dominate the narrative of organized crime in Latin America. They also dominate the attention of law enforcement to the extent that we have that. But there are other types of groups, and the ones that we're studying, which are environmental criminal networks. These are not what you imagine when you think of a drug cartel. They're generally different groups. There's some overlap in Colombia, but so far, apparently not in Brazil. These entail business people in São Paulo, Curitiba, and major cities who are financing highly professionalized operations in illegal gold mining, by the way, to feed the European market, among others. Illegal extraction of wood, land invasion, setting fire to make space for ranching and soybeans. So we need to expand the scope of what we understand by these criminal and violence-inducing actors. But we also have illegal armed groups that are sponsored by the state and that fuel sometimes into a context of open conflict. This was the case in Colombia, where you have a history of paramilitary groups. You have the BACRIM with a nebulous origin in relationship to the state. Here in Haiti, you have gangs, urban gangs, especially in Port-au-Prince, who have fueled patterns of violence that are maybe hybrid between what we call violent crime and open conflict. And here in Brazil, we have a very difficult discussion right now about whether this is happening. You know, the militias that are largely based here in Rio and in Belém, Pará, they clearly have connections to politicians, including very high-level politicians. So you combine that with this trend of militarization of public policy, which is common not only in Mexico, in Colombia, but here in Brazil, with the deployment, for instance, of the military, of the armed forces within public security. And you have levels of state brutality that also should be counted. Right now, we have a slight decrease in the number of homicides in Brazil, which stems from policies that were taken during previous governments. But at the same time, we have a sharp escalation in police brutality. So when we, to go back to climate, when we think about the role of climate, we have to understand that we're not talking about dissipate patterns of homicides because Latin Americans are, violent people. Some of them are very violent people, but they're violent because we have this ecology of actors and institutions and perverse state action that is fueling unbelievable amounts of violence. Just here in Rio, to end it with one statistic, this whole discussion of police brutality in the United States, more people were killed by the police in my city of Rio de Janeiro than in the entire United States in the past year. So there's a lot to be uncovered when we talk about what insecurity means here in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Another question from Katie Peters from ODI. She said that all of the speakers mentioned climate-related disasters as an escalator of social and violent conflict. But the climate security cadre has struggled to link effectively with humanitarian and disaster risk management actors. What practical steps can we take to address this moving forward? Maybe we can start with you, Ottilia. How can we get this link better between humanitarian and disaster risk management? And then I would also invite the others to come in.
That's such an important question, because I think what's rooted in it is the current disconnect between the immediate disaster management and need for that sustained humanitarian action. And quite frankly, I do think that it needs to be way more aligned than it is. Often we see almost a siloing, if I can put it that way, a siloing of interventions, right? So you have, depending on the situation, you have at the national level, very key community level organizers who would be able to assist in the longer term humanitarian action, but that are simply called on to aid in the immediate interventions, if I can call it that way. And I think the more we align these efforts, essentially the better. And at the moment, looking at what's currently going on, and I didn't want to bring this up, but I think the current responses that we're seeing to COVID-19 are almost forcing countries, at least at national level, but also regional and continental level, to understand that even an immediate threat has longer lasting impact, and you need to be able to get all the actors on board to do that. A lot of what was said earlier, for example, around ensuring that we advance the issues of human rights and development have to be underscored here. And I'll stress the last point, which is something that Adriana said earlier around inequality. Inequality isn't something that just happens. It's a long-term issue that needs to be addressed both as an urgent concern, but also through sustained efforts. And what does that mean in reality? It means emphasizing the need to deal with the most vulnerable first, but also enabling an environment that ensures that they don't remain in that vulnerability.
Thank you. Maybe linking that to another question I received from Gerald Stang, and something that you just said, Ottilia, on kind of the silos. So Gerald Stang is a senior advisor at Global Affairs Canada, and he asks, how can we ensure that efforts to address climate security do not create silos or distract from holistic peace-building efforts that seek to address the whole range of conflict drivers. And I think that's a really important question. We always say to address climate security risks, we have to kind of like work across silos, but how do we also ensure that our agenda doesn't kind of narrow the very broad peace-building approaches? And maybe I would invite Chitra again, and then also Adriana to kind of reflect on that, starting with Chitra.
Yes, thank you. Interesting question. I would start by not seeing climate security and peace building as oppositional to each other. I think for me, good climate security takes the peace building approach and addresses a lot of the drivers that peace building work seeks to address. And this is why we always say in climate security conversations that yes, there's an issue of climate change and conflict, but underlying all of this are issues of governance, of corruption, of inequality, of patriarchal gender norms, and all of that, those must be read into climate security discussions for those discussions both to be accurate but also meaningful. And at the same time, peace building work really needs to understand climate security risks to be effective and be meaningful. However, saying that, I do think that there is a risk of conversations around climate security being instrumentalized or politicized in order to enable governments to evade responsibility or to cloud the role of failures of governance when it comes to explaining the reasons why we are in the situation that we're in. And I think we need to really make sure that we guard against this. That the reason for high levels of insecurity, the situation in terms of livelihoods, is not because of climate change. I don't think you cannot draw a linear line between climate change causing conflict. It's a lot more complex than that. And I think it's very important to kind of keep stating that. I know that there is a drive towards simplicity, and sometimes there can be a pressure towards that to try and kind of build the case for urgent action when it comes to climate change, when it comes to climate security. But I think we're really doing a disservice to ourselves if we follow that, not least because all the conversations about climate change are underpinned by science. And we keep saying, we need to take action on climate change, we need to pay attention to the science. And as part of that, that means that we really need to reflect reality as it is. And that means acknowledging the role of other grievances, of issues like governance, of looking at situations between communities in order to get a real understanding of what climate security means, and also to make sure that we link that with peace building efforts. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of injecting climate security into peace building practice. Still, I don't see enough peace building actors really acknowledging the role of climate security when it comes to their conflict analysis and into their programming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just quickly over to you, Adriana. Same question, how do we avoid the silos and ensure that we really have a broad peace-building approach that integrates climate and conflict risks?
Thank you. That is indeed a challenge because we still speak very different languages. Those of us who work in social science research, climate change research seems like a completely separate bubble for the most part, and of course policymakers who have to try to distill and understand our messages. And I think that this points to multi-stakeholder models as being absolutely essential because you need to incorporate this. So we need better links to scientific communities, but we also need a mutual learning process where we are using the same language and not just speaking across each other. I think we also need to better incorporate climate and security dimensions into risk assessments, including early warning systems, as you call them sometimes in the West. The European Union has been playing around with this a little bit more. I had the chance to participate in one of the excellent research workshops that are put together to incorporate innovations. Of course, at the UN, the Climate and Security Mechanism has been doing a tremendous job against many odds, and they have come up with some interesting innovations in risk assessments. But in some of the regional organizations, this is not happening. And Latin America has a multiplicity of regional organizations, but I say that they are zombies. They are practically paralyzed, especially, I think, in the climate action area, with the exception of CARICOM. I think the island countries and the Caribbean countries are at the forefront of thinking about how to pool knowledge and resources. And then finally, overall, we need to pay attention to this discourse of prevention rather than just response. Because when you think about response, historically has been very much in silos. It has been carried out by UNDRR or OCHA, or within the European Union, as I understand, also very specialized. But prevention requires a longer-term approach, and therefore needs to tap into many different epistemic communities and policy-making pools. So I think that taking seriously the idea of prevention and adapting it within the climate and security area is absolutely essential to breaking down the silos. Thank you.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, but I have one last question from a colleague from CIPRI, Dr. Johan Shah. He's Associate Senior Fellow at CIPRI. And he says climate-related insecurity easily lends itself to a simplistic and dramatic narrative. In reality, we know that it is highly context-specific and interacts with a range of factors that increase the likelihood of insecurity. And he asked the question, how can we avoid, against this background, the risk of simplistic policy solutions? And I would like to invite each of you to give me one idea of how to kind of avoid that risk. 30 seconds. Starting with Olli.
Okay, 30 seconds. I mean, it links really well to the last question. The main point is don't have single issue people like myself setting security policy. We are inherently a bit of a silo ourselves. We talk to each other, we think about climate security. We ourselves need to look back up and think about the multiplicity of issues, as Adriana was saying. And we don't want to be the voice on climate security, we just want to be a voice on general security issues. So I think we all need to sort of make sure that we're looking beyond our own narrow horizons.
Okay, thank you. Ottilia, what is your idea to avoid simplistic policy solutions?
Right, I think Adriana has actually answered this already, which is essentially that we need as much as possible to involve communities in learning and understanding what the real issues are. I think it's one thing to impose policy from up here, when in fact it has to apply as much as possible at the ground level. And to do that, you need evidence. Any policy that is not informed by evidence is more likely than not doomed to fail.
Thank you. Adriana, over to you.
My recommendation is to always start by literally drawing a graph in which you try to think of all of the factors. Forget about climate security nexus. Sorry if I'm voicing an unpopular opinion. But I think that if you sit down and you really draw all of the arrows and you're going to get a very messy graphic, you will remind yourself of how complex. Now, there's a whole academic discussion about it's very difficult to quantify the impact of individual factors. But you can trace the paths, including causal paths, by not forgetting how complex the cycle is and how many factors come in. And this is important not just for risk assessment and diagnostics, but also equally for policy design.
Okay, over to you, Chitra, for the last word.
Yes, thank you. For me, it really comes back to focusing on people's lived realities in all their complexities and diversities. So for the Lake Chad Basin assessment, I spoke to 250 people. Those were one-on-one interviews, spending any time between 20 minutes to an hour and a half, 2 hours with them. And during that, you really realize that people do not live siloed lives. And by really kind of focusing and understanding the totality of their lives, that avoids us from having siloed analysis, programming, and policies. So I think for me, like, really focus on the people who are living through conflict, living through climate change.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have many more questions, but unfortunately our time is over. Again, sorry for anyone who experienced audio or video problems. We will have a recording of this session and all of the other sessions online at the conference website by the end of the week. So you can revisit them also then with good audio if you had problems. Now I would like to thank the panelists. Thank you so much for all your insights. This was tremendously interesting. I'm so happy I was able to facilitate this super interesting session. Also thank you to everyone who tuned in from at home, from their offices, and for all the good questions. Before I close the session, I want to mention again that there is a second part to the Berlin conference on climate change and security that will follow in September in October with a number of deep dive sessions, very much like what we had right now, but on specific issues on urbanization and climate change, on gender dynamics and climate change and conflict, as well as what we're just talking about, the quantitative research and the newest findings on that. So today, the conference will continue at 2:45 Central European summertime. We will, with a high-level political segment, and we will take a break now. And with this, I would like to close the session. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe.